Patriots of the Revolutionary era often used Scripture to justify their cause. John Cleveland, an evangelical leader of the time, in fact, emphasized the folly of trying to separate the sources of revolutionary ideology into categories of secular and religious. To him, they were one and the same. After all, during the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution a century earlier, English kings had been deposed and executed in the name of Protestant liberty. This history taught the colonists that Christian subjects should obey good kings and rebel against corruption. John Adams had likened America at this time to a Christian Sparta, a republic with both the ideals and the spiritual motivation to maintain the common good. Thomas Jefferson even suggested that the Patriots appeal to God in the same way that the Puritans had done during the French and Indian War. The chapter I chose to analyze comes from the book Sacred Scripture, Sacred War by James Byrne. In the book, Byrne observes this invocation of Scripture specifically as it relates to one particular biblical hero. In the chapter titled, Teacheth My Hands to War and My Fingers to Fight, David's Revolutionary Heroism, James Byrne assesses the overwhelming popularity of David in colonial warfare. Many people thought it was contradictory to preach the gospel of Christ in the aggression of violent revolution, so patriot ministers turned to David. Byrne organizes his article by stating that the references to David in patriot ministry can be classified under three distinct headings: David the warrior, David the psalmist, and David the monarch. The story of a young, virtuous shepherd taking on and defeating a battle-hardened, prideful giant was one that struck a chord with many of the patriots. It was one that had been used before, too. Jonathan Edwards, in 1755, preached a sermon to English soldiers who were about to attack the French on Lake Champlain. In this sermon, he quoted from 1 Samuel 17:45, where David addresses Goliath. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. The Continental Congress, taking from Edwards, invoked this story as well to illustrate the revolutionary crisis in a 1779 statement, where they said, America, without arms, ammunition, discipline, revenue, government, or ally, almost totally stripped of commerce and in the weakness of youth, as it were, with a staff and a sling, dared in the name of the Lord of hosts to engage a gigantic adversary, prepared at all points, boasting of his strength, and whom even mighty warriors were greatly afraid. James Byrne states that for Congress, David's victory inspired the colonists not to trust in numbers, but in the miraculous possibilities of a courageous people and a righteous cause. In their eyes, the British epitomized the 1 Samuel depiction of Goliath as an arrogant, prideful, boasting behemoth. Some patriots even satirized specific British officers. Patriot military chaplain Hugh Henry Brackenridge applied British General John Burgoyne's defeat at Saratoga to Goliath's taunting in 1 Samuel 17:43. O ye saints and rebels of New England, wherefore are ye come out against me with pitchforks and with pruning hooks? Am I a dog that you think you can drive me into Lake Champlain with staves and bayonets? The David and Goliath comparison was not lost on the British. They viewed it as a righteous warning, with British Methodist John Fletcher delivering a sermon where he cautions his people. The Americans were wrong-headed Davids, but they are Davids nonetheless. A youth that believes and prays as David is a match for a giant that swaggers and curses as Goliath. Next is David the psalmist. While many historians have focused on patriotic uses of the book of Revelation, wartime preachers often cited the Psalms. Most colonists considered David to be the author of the Psalms, and since many of those Psalms contained David's prayers during times of battle, it made sense that they were popular among patriot preachers. The most prominent of the Psalms that was quoted was Psalm 144:1. Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war, my fingers to fight. Many doubted that this martial call to war came from God. They had trouble reconciling the gospel of Christ with the aggression of violent revolution. For many preachers who turned to the Psalms, however, they found three main points for justification. David does indeed acknowledge that war is terrible. Despite this, there is an art to war that distinguishes honorable soldiers from heathen barbarians, and most crucially, David was a master of this art because God instructed him in it. Each victory for David was a vindication of the patriots' righteous, martial zeal. After all, David was the man after God's own heart. Finally, David the monarch, the revolutionary fall of the house of David. Despite how comfortably the story of David fits into the patriot narrative, there was one glaring issue. David became Israel's favored king. Not only was David himself a king, but he remained loyal to the vile King Saul, despite Saul's many attempts to have him killed. The Bible portrays loyalty to monarchy as one of his best attributes. How then could the patriot cause justify using David as their hero? Thomas Paine justified it in common sense by leaning into a technicality. The high encomium given of David takes no notice of him officially as king, but only as a man after God's own heart. This led into the primary Republican argument. that David's royal authority actually led to his corruption and downfall. This corruption was manifested in his adultery with Bathsheba. For this, his reign became a chaotic story of betrayal and civil war. Absalom, David's son, betrayed him in an attempt to wrest control, and was killed by David's military commander Joab. Rehoboam, David's grandson, later became a tyrant against which the people of Israel rebelled. Against this backdrop, it was easy for the patriots to liken King George II to David, with his son, the tyrant King George III, taking on the role of Absalom or Rehoboam. With this in mind, the patriots didn't just have a warning against the volatility of monarchy, but they had biblical precedent for a rebellion against just such a monarchy, even against the house of David, the man after God's own heart. I found this article fascinating. I agree with Byrne in his assessment that historians leaving contemporary preachers' their invocation of David in any of his three roles out of the narrative does miss quite a few points. David the warrior speaks to the militant spirit of soldiers in the face of such adversity, and David the monarch is such a clear example of monarchy corrupting even the best of men. The illusions the patriots made were effective at the time, and they even last to this day. In the World War II film Saving Private Ryan, directed by Steven Spielberg, a soldier can be seen quoting Psalm 144:1 as he lines up a shot on a Nazi. While I was in Army basic training, one of my drill sergeants even had this verse tattooed on his forearm. The invocation of David's righteous militancy is just as powerful a motivator in the Revolutionary era as it is today. One thing I noticed being left out of this article was any reference of the patriots likening George Washington to David. Thomas Jefferson is noted as alluding to Washington as a Samson in the field and a Solomon in the council. While he was saying this as the preface to an insult he was crafting against the president, certainly that can't be the only time people had ascribed biblical heroes to the greatest hero of the age. And what biblical hero better fits George Washington than the man after God's own heart? Ron Chernow, in his biography of Washington, acknowledges that the man does seem to have been blessed by some special providence, referring to him as fortune's favorite.